Hi and welcome. My name is Christy Sullivan. I work at Cornell University in the Department of Natural Resources. I'm trained as a wildlife biologist, and at Cornell I'm an extension associate, which means that I do a lot of outreach with private forest landowners and the general public focused on how to conserve and manage habitat for wildlife. I also direct the New York Master Naturalist Program, which is a program for adults who want to do conservation volunteer work. So let me begin my presentation. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about woodland habitat for wildlife and biodiversity. And just to give an overview of the benefits of forests, healthy forests provide many benefits to us, carbon sequestration being one of them, water purification is another, controlling floodwaters and slowing the waters, producing forest products, things like maple syrup and lumber for building and construction and many other products, and also providing us with places to recreate and some health benefits too, both mental health benefits of being outdoor in nature and also the physical health benefits of getting exercise outdoors. And forests also provide wildlife habitat. So suitable habitat for wildlife includes a number of different elements, some that are pretty straightforward and easy to understand, things like food. It can be anything from berries or foliage if you're an insect, nuts and other fruits from trees and plants. Also, water is a very important habitat element, especially for some species that require water to complete their development. Cover, and that could be nesting cover, so someplace to nest, or cover to hide from predators, or cover to escape the elements, especially during the winter time, or the heat and dryness in the summertime. And the needs of organisms can differ throughout the seasons or at different life stages. So, for example, an eastern newt requires water as an egg and a developing larvae, but as a juvenile comes out onto land and he walks around the forest and lives in the forest for 4 to 7 years before then going back to the water as an adult. So at different stages of life, different organisms need different types of habitat, sometimes very different types of habitat. To provide habitat for the greatest variety of forest species, you want to try to provide large contiguous tracts of forest. And that can mean entire landscapes, meaning about 2,500 acres, so very large acreage if you're thinking about a landscape. Within that landscape, that forested landscape, you want to provide a diversity of tree and plant species. You want to have some young forests that are less than or equal to 20 years old, and then some older forests and some very mature, very old forests. So a combination of different ages of forests. You want to provide adequate water resources, and then there's some special habitat elements and features that are important, especially for certain species of wildlife. When it comes to a variety of forest ages, historically, diverse forest conditions were created by natural disturbances, things like beavers building dams and creating impoundments that then flooded areas and created shrubby wetlands and open meadows. Wind could be a factor that created a natural disturbance in a forest, windstorms, fire historically in some areas, ice storms, so ice accumulating on tree branches and causing the trees to actually fall down, and flood events were another example of historic conditions or disturbances that may have created a diversity of forest ages. And in this picture, you can see that a gap has been created in this forest, or an opening, where a large mature tree has fallen down. That allows the sunlight to enter, and then there was some regrowth or regeneration of young forests beneath. In the 1900s, early 1900s, a lot of farmland was abandoned. They were finding that farmland was not very productive in a lot of areas. And so a lot of land was kind of abandoned at the same time. In a lot of cases, natural disturbances were suppressed. So beavers maybe were not allowed to build their dams, fire would have been put out. There were a lot of natural disturbances that weren't allowed to occur in the way that they may have in the past. And the result was abundant forest cover that we have today. And most of our forest cover is mature or, like full grown adult trees. And most of our forest is similar in age because a lot of the trees started to grow when the forests were first abandoned when the agricultural areas were first abandoned in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So this slide depicts a picture from Tompkins County, New York. And in the top, you can see the picture has a lot of pasture land in the background. And on the bottom picture, you can see it's the same building, but with forest land grown up. And that's in the 1970s. So basically, that's the story across much of both Pennsylvania and New York State. So we have a lot of mature forest, and in many areas, very little young forest in many areas. So what I want to cover today is kind of an overview of forest, wildlife habitat, and biodiversity. I want to talk about the big picture, how you can think about your property or any given piece of property or forest in the context of the surrounding landscape. I want to talk about habitat connections and the importance of keeping connections among forest parcels. I want to talk about forest structure. So what is horizontal diversity and what is vertical diversity and what does that mean for wildlife? And I also want to talk about water or aquatic resources and the importance of those resources to wildlife. And last but not least, I mentioned some unique habitats and some ways that we can focus on enhancing habitat regardless of the age or type of forest that we might have. So first of all, looking at the big picture. So looking at the big picture means how does your piece of land or the piece of land that you may be considering, how does it fit into the bigger puzzle? So what does the surrounding area look like? Who owns it? That can tell you a lot about how you might expect it to be managed in the future. What is the forest structure like? So how is it a lot of mature forest of all one age that looks very homogeneous, or is it a variety of different ages? And is there a mixture of other habitat types sprinkled in with the forest habitat across the landscape, or is it a mostly forested landscape? So when you talk about the big picture, people always ask, well, how big? How big should I look, or how big should I be considering? And really, it depends on the species. You may have some songbirds, for example, that use have a small territory and don't use much area. Or you might have something like an owl, which requires a larger territory and spans a great deal of distance. So it does depend on the species, but if you consider roughly 9 square miles, that's a good rule of thumb. So you can get the big picture and look at an area this size these days very easily. We're very fortunate these days that we have a lot of tools available to us for free online. We have Google Earth, we have Google Maps, and these tools can allow us to zoom in on any area, look at a satellite image, get an aerial view, and see what the area is like right around our surrounding properties. Sometimes there are even some tools where you can see your specific tax parcel overlaid on the aerial photo. So for example, you may live in an area like the picture on the right where it's very contiguous forest, it's a heavily forested landscape, or you may live in an area, something like the picture on the left, where you have a mixture of forest and agricultural land uses with some residential areas sprinkled through. And in this case, there happens to be a lake to the east in this picture. I just want to go through a couple of examples, or a few examples of what if you were considering this property within the red lines. What does this property offer, or what does it offer in terms of the big picture? What does it contribute to the landscape in terms of wildlife habitat, forest wildlife habitat specifically? So in this picture, when I look at the area within the red box, I see that if that was my property, that would contain kind of the biggest chunk of forested area in that view. It also serves as a corridor linking the forest to the north and the forest to the south with the forest to the west. So it's important not only as providing a lot of forest habitat, but also in terms of linking forest habitats to one another. So I would think that keeping that area as forest habitat, and probably mature forest habitat, but definitely not cutting it heavily, would be really important. Okay, but now here's another picture. If I owned this land, and it would be wonderful to own that land, this is a very heavily forested landscape. It's pretty homogeneous. There's not much variety in this picture. You can see to the east, you can see a little bit of texture there, like there may have been a large timber harvest a number of years ago. So there might be a little bit of variety in terms of the age structure of the forest, but there aren't many openings and there's not much variety. So in this case, maybe a timber harvest or some sort of management to create a younger forest to come up and give some age diversity, or a few small openings in the forest here and there to create some diversity in habitat might be beneficial things that you could consider. Now in this picture, this shows a specific habitat element. In this picture, this is, if I owned that property, I would be owning evergreen forest or coniferous forest in an otherwise deciduous forest landscape. So I might look at that and think, wow, I have something unique. I have evergreen forest that could provide important cover for wildlife during the winter where they can escape the snow and the elements. Or in the summertime, it might provide a cooler microclimate for wildlife. So here I can see that I have a special habitat element. And the same could go for other habitat types as well. Maybe you have a wetland on your property, or maybe you have a stream that runs through your property in a landscape that otherwise doesn't have those water features. That's something to consider as well. Okay, in addition to looking at the big picture, you might also consider maintaining sufficient habitat patch sizes and connections. And I mentioned that a little bit in the one picture that I showed. But really what this means is, if you look at the illustration at the top here, where you have two small areas of forest with no connections. And then the next picture to the right has a few little patches in between that you might refer to as stepping stones. So if you were a bird and you were trying to go from one section of forest to another, you'd have those little stepping stones as stopover points where you could land and feed. Same if you were a mammal and you were moving from one area to a forest to another, you'd have a little bit of cover along the way. The next picture to the right shows a little bit of a corridor stretching out more than the stepping stones in the previous picture. And the final picture that kind of looks like a dog bone there is a full-fledged corridor kind of connecting one patch to another. And so that's what we would strive for, looking for ways to make connections whenever possible. Oftentimes, an easy way to do this is to have forest corridors along streams called riparian corridors. So this serves two different purposes. One is that it provides a kind of a buffer along the stream of forest habitat, and it also can serve as a connection between forest habitat patches. So, and then the last connection to consider is establishing patches between forests and aquatic habitats. So connecting forests to aquatic habitats and connecting forests to forest areas, or connecting them along a riparian corridor. Okay, so forests, an important thing about forests is that forests are very dynamic. They have many parts. They have wildlife, plants, invertebrates, soils, some bedrock and other features. And the parts of a forest are constantly interacting and changing. Whether we do anything to purposely manage our forests or not, they're constantly going to be changing. And this process is called forest succession. And typically, forest succession is referred to as, if you have fields and shrubs in a young forest, that's considered early successional habitat. And then late successional habitat would be as forests grow and mature and get older. So you have like a mature forest and then a climax forest, or what we refer to as an old growth forest. So there's kind of a continuum of ages and stages as forests age. And with that continuum, you'll have different species of wildlife. So in an early successional forest, for example, you will maybe have deer, and you might have the ruffed grouse. In an open field area, you will have grasshoppers, and then you will have bluebirds that can feed on those grasshoppers, and maybe snakes that feed on those grasshoppers. And then all the way up to where you have a very mature forest to the right there, where you will have porcupines living, and then maybe fishers, which you can see in the top right of the slide. And fishers are specialized predators on porcupines. So where you have porcupines and contiguous mature forest, you might expect to have fishers. So the type of forest you have and the age and the stage, successional stage, will depend or will dictate what types of wildlife you might expect to have there. Okay, now I want to talk about two different terms that are used to describe forest habitat, and actually habitat of all types. But the first is horizontal diversity. So horizontal diversity really means the patchiness of the arrangement of different forest types, age and size classes, as well as other habitat types across the landscape. So for example, in this picture, you can see you have some deciduous forest, you have some coniferous forest, you have a wetland down there at the bottom, looks like with a stream running through. You have patches of other habitat types intermingled. So there's a lot of horizontal diversity here. And just within a forest, you can have a lot of horizontal diversity in terms of the type of forest and the age and size classes of the trees. There's another term called vertical diversity. And what vertical diversity means is basically the structure within the forest. So it means the number of different layers of vegetation you have within the forest. So this slide kind of illustrates that concept, where you have your herbaceous layer, where you might have ferns or other understory plants, the forest floor covered with leaf litter, and then you can have a shrub layer, an understory layer, a mid-story layer, and then the overstory, or the canopy trees are at the very highest point of the forest. So some forests have all those components and would have a lot of vertical diversity. Others are very low in vertical diversity and maybe more simplified. So for example, in this slide to the left, you can see that you have the canopy of the forest. So you have the overstory trees, it's a more mature forest, but underneath you're missing a lot of elements. You don't have a mid-story, there aren't any trees growing in the understory, there's no shrub layer. There's a little bit of fern cover on the forest floor, but even the herbaceous layer is kind of a little bit deplete. So it's a very simple structure versus the forest to the right, where it was a mature forest with a timber harvest. There's still some overstory trees left. And so there's a little bit of canopy, though it's very open. The sunlight's been allowed to come in, and there's a lot of growth underneath. So you can see that new young trees are growing, it's young forest underneath, and you do have the shrub and maybe understory layer, and eventually that will reach the mid-story layer. So there's a little bit more diversity there. You have at least 2 or 3 layers in that picture. So generally, as forests age or experience disturbance, their structures will also change. And a complex vertical structure has a well-developed overstory, understory, shrub, and herbaceous layer, and that's really beneficial to wildlife, and especially to birds. Birds tend to divide habitat vertically depending on the species. So for example, you may have a scarlet tanager that nests and spends a lot of time in the forest canopy, or you might have something like black-capped chickadee that spends more time in the understory or the mid-canopy. And you may have something like an ovenbird that is a forest floor species, or spends most of its time on the ground or in the understory. So here's another picture of something that would be similar to old growth forest, where there may have been a gap formed, some sort of a blowdown or some sort of disturbance, there's a small gap, the sunlight is allowed in, and then you get that young growth underneath. And so that's a more complex vertical structure than what we saw in the two pictures before that. You have a little bit in each layer of the forest. So the greater the number of forest types and the forest structures that are present in your forest, the greater the potential for more wildlife species overall. Many species occur in several forest types and size classes. So deer, for example, will occur in just about any forest age or type or size class, though they would find more food in young forests than in mature forests. And others are specific to just one. So maybe the fisher is a good example of that. It prefers mature forest. And then some require forest in close proximity to other habitat types. So maybe wetlands or streams. Some of our turtles like to overwinter in streams. So with a wood turtle, for example, but it's basically a forest species for the rest of the year. That's just a couple examples. When it comes to birds, there is a whole suite of birds that are considered early successional forest birds, so birds that prefer young forest ages. And some of those birds are the chestnut-sided warbler, which is pictured to the left here, the indigo bunting in the middle, and the black and white warbler on the right. And basically for this group as a whole, and it varies by the individual species, but as a whole, these birds tend to increase in abundance, be more abundant in young forests. And that's what the slide's showing here. So fewer in mature forests, some in mixed age forests, and then most abundant in young forests. Now our mature forest birds are a little bit different. Here's pictured the ovenbird, the black-throated green warbler, and the wood thrush, just as examples of mature forest birds. There are many more. But for these birds as a group, they also tend to be more abundant in mature forests. That's why they're considered mature forest birds. But they're still quite abundant in mixed age forests. So as long as there's some forest canopy, they're still going to be present. And even where there's very little forest canopy, they're still present, though they do decline in numbers. So they're not as abundant during the nesting season. And again, these are birds during the nesting season. They're not as abundant in young forests. They're much less abundant, but it takes removing most of the forest canopy before they really decline significantly. And even these mature forest birds, and here's a few more, the black-throated blue warbler, the scarlet tanager, and the wood thrush, even these species that prefer mature forests during the nesting season, they tend to move to young forests to feed after the young have left the nest. So that's called the post-fledging period. And so many of them move to younger forests, and the reason is probably because there's more abundant food there. So a lot of these birds migrate to the neotropics for the winter, and they and their young have to fuel up, put on a lot of weight for migration. And in mature forests where you don't have a lot of foliage for insects to be present, you don't have a lot of fruit producing shrubs and berries and things like that, there just isn't as much food. So these species tend to nest in mature forests, but then in the late summer and early fall, they're in younger forests, fueling up for migration. Okay, another group, so mammals are probably very similar to birds. Some prefer mature forests, some prefer early successional, younger forests, some might prefer, a mix of habitats. Amphibians and reptiles probably are opposite of one another. Amphibians really, forest amphibians, especially salamanders, don't do well in dry, hot conditions. They tend to thrive in moist and shaded forests. So in their case, a forest that's more mature, has a closed canopy, and is more dark and shaded would be preferred habitat. On the other hand, forest reptiles, things like snakes, and we have the northern coal skink in parts of New York. There's also a skink in Pennsylvania. These reptiles, they live in forests, but they do like younger forests or they'll do well in more mature forests as long as there are some sunny openings for basking and maybe finding more insect prey. So for reptiles, it's probably a little bit different, or almost the opposite of amphibians. So the take-home messages for vertical diversity, vertical structural diversity in forests is that the forest structure heavily influences the organisms that will live there. You will find the highest species diversity usually where there's greater vertical diversity, basically more layers of forest, especially for birds, more layers of vegetation. And having a diversity of stand ages and structures in a region, not necessarily within one property. You might not be able to provide everything with your one property, especially if it's small. But again, you can consider what your property can add to the greater region. So having a high diversity of stand ages and structures in the region and across the landscape can provide more habitat for all. And vertical structure is influenced by natural disturbances, or it can be changed through intentional forest management or timber harvesting. So timber harvesting basically is used to mimic natural disturbances and the gaps that they create and allow sunlight in to grow new trees. Okay, so what's working against us? Well, this picture kind of highlights that. You see here there's a forest with an overstory canopy and nothing but ferns in the understory. And the reason for that is that deer don't like to eat ferns. And so as a result, ferns can become established where deer are eating the other vegetation, wildflowers, for example, and tree seedlings. And then something like ferns can take over and prevent other things from growing. So the Nature Conservancy in New York State about 10 years ago looked at regeneration, or basically the ability to grow new trees in New York State. They did some modeling. And what they found is in this picture, what you're looking at is that anything that's green, dark green is the best, light green is next. Then there's orange, which is fair, and red, which is poor. And this slide is showing where they predict that native tree canopy species are able to regrow. So if you cut the current canopy down, would you get regeneration or regrowth of native, successful regrowth of native trees? And 68% of the state was good to very good, but over a third of the forest was considered poor or fair in terms of our ability to regrow trees. And some regions were worse than others. And I think the same thing would be true in Pennsylvania. So the interesting thing is there's another model they did looking at species that are desirable timber species, which are things like oak and sugar maple. And for me, from a wildlife perspective, not thinking of it in terms of timber, though, I think of it in terms of valuable wildlife trees and wildlife food producing trees. And when they looked at just those species, it was even more grim. So we're really facing a challenge in terms of regrowing new trees, new forests, and the primary driver for this is the impacts that deer are having, deer browsing is having on our forests today. So this slide shows a forest that was harvested, lightly harvested. It was harvested in the same way. The only difference between the right side of the slide and the left side is that deer were excluded using a fence from the right side of the forest. And you can see that there's profuse growth of a diversity of different kinds of seedlings coming up where deer did not have access. Whereas on the left hand of the slide, you can see there's a lot of fern on the forest floor, which is going to block seedlings from being able to grow. It forms thick mats of roots and also blocks sunlight, and so prevents trees from regrowing once they become established. You can also see something called a browse line. If you look in that picture to the left, there's basically nothing growing up to the height of 6 feet or so, and that's the height at which deer can reach. And they can reach, especially in the winter on top of the snowpack, they can reach, if they stand up on their hind legs, about 6 feet tall. So that's called a browse line. So you can see that deer can have a significant impact on the regrowth of our forests. They can cause something, layers to be missing. So this is a picture of a forest where the canopy is somewhat open. There is sunlight reaching the forest floor. You would expect something to be there, but it's pretty much devoid of vegetation. And so we're missing that vertical structural diversity and those layers that are so important to other wildlife as habitat. There's been a lot of research over the years looking at how deer affect other wildlife species, and especially songbirds who rely on those different layers of vegetation in the forest. And this is a picture showing some research that was done at Allegheny National Forest in northwestern Pennsylvania. And these deer densities, they actually closed deer in at different densities, known densities of deer, and then looked at the effects that they had on the intermediate canopy songbirds. So those who are in the mid-story or understory, that layer that's often missing. And the deer density to the right is the highest at 80 per square mile. And you can see that basically as deer density increased, the number of songbirds that are observed decreased. So there was a direct correlation between deer density and the number of songbirds. There's a more recent study out of New Jersey looking again at mid-story shrub and ground nesting species, finding that a lot of our birds who are in those categories are declining, whereas a lot of canopy nesters in the overstory in New Jersey have been increasing in numbers or are stable. And they speculated that one of the biggest drivers for this, again, is deer browsing and the lack of those layers of vegetation that the mid-story shrub and ground nesters might depend on for nesting. So horizontal and vertical structural diversity is important in forests. However, small-scale changes can also improve habitat for many species, regardless of the forest type you have or the age of your forest. And so I'm going to talk about some of those now. So some things you can do when you recognize some of these unique habitat features is to make sure you try to manage for them or retain them on your property or on the land that you might manage. Things like beaver ponds, rocky outcrops, or old home sites with rock walls can be great sites for snakes and for skinks, small mammals to find cover. There's the picture on the left shows actually an area near Ithaca, New York, where we take our class. It's in a wildlife management area. And it's really kind of making lemonade out of lemons. There was an area where historically dirt bikes were riding up and down the slope. It's exactly what you don't want to do, create erosion. And but in this case, it exposed a lot of shale and rocks. And this has become, it's an important basking area for snakes in the spring. So woodland snakes come from the forest, they hibernate nearby, they come out and they kind of go under the rocks. We found maybe 6 different species of snakes and also the northern coal skink at this site. They kind of warm up, they feed a little bit, and then they probably move out into the forest for the remainder of the summer season. But some of these sites can be very important as basking areas. You can also focus on protecting and maintaining aquatic features. So anywhere there's water, you're going to have species that depend on the water or species that just visit the water features to drink, for example, and might not actually depend on it to complete their life cycle, but still depend on it for drinking. So for example, on the left, there's a picture of a vernal pool, and we'll talk about those, or woodland, seasonal woodland pool, we like to call them, or streams, for example. I talked about how some of our turtles, woodland turtles, really require streams for overwintering habitat. We have northern water snakes that use these features. A lot of different forest animals can be associated with water as well. There can be something like a very small pond in a forest that can provide habitat, or a very large wetland as pictured down below here that provide a nice variety of habitat within a forested landscape. There are seasonal woodland pools, or you may have heard them called vernal pools, and they're very important habitat features within forests. It's important to go out and walk your forest or walk the land at different seasons, sometimes to even recognize that you have them available. So this slide shows a picture of a vernal pool or seasonal woodland pool in the winter time. And then you see the same pool pictured in the spring. And then you see in the summer, had you visited that site only in the summer, the water's dried up. It dries up for the summer, and you may not even know that it's there. And the fact that they dry up is really important because that means that fish can't live in these water features. And fish are predators of a lot of amphibian eggs and larvae. And so where there are fish, you often have a lower diversity of amphibians. So these pools are very important. They provide breeding habitat for amphibians and some invertebrate species, things like some dragonflies and damselflies, or berry shrimp are vernal pool or woodland pool dependent species. They provide foraging habitat for other animals. So for example, raccoons or skunks may come to those pools to find food. They would eat the eggs maybe of the amphibians, or the tadpoles, or the frogs, or the salamanders themselves. And so it's a little like a little feeding station. And as I mentioned before, woodland pools by definition don't support fish. So the species you see here, if you don't recognize them, is spotted salamander up to at the top, the black salamander with yellow spots. The Jefferson salamander is closely related. It's in the same family, but it's a much duller kind of grayish tan salamander. And there's a picture of the spotted salamander eggs, which you might see in a woodland pool if you look for them in the spring. They lay their eggs in April, and then so they come to the water, they lay their eggs, and then they go back to the forest for the rest of the year. So they're really forest species, but they depend on that woodland pool for laying their eggs and for the larvae to hatch and grow until they move out onto land. So woodland pools are often referred to as the coral reefs of the forest, just like a coral reef in the ocean where you have a lot of activity, a lot of food, and other organisms coming in to feed, a little feeding station, and then take that energy back into the ocean. It's the same thing with woodland pools. Species coming in, feeding, and then going back into the woods and creating a flow of energy from the forest to the seasonal woodland pool and back out. So they're really active and interesting areas, and interesting to explore too, both for kids and adults if you want to get out and kind of do some searching, and especially in the spring. April, May, June is a good time to look for either the eggs of amphibians that were laid there or the tadpoles or larvae. Okay, another habitat feature that you can focus on is maintaining healthy stream buffers. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but a buffer, a riparian buffer they're called, along a stream or a wetland is really very important in terms of habitat, because a lot of species will use those areas. And also they're kind of unique because they are important in also maintaining water quality for the organisms that live in the water. So they provide shade over the water to cool the water, and they provide an input of leaf litter when the leaves fall off, and that leaf litter provides the base of the food chain for other organisms. So aquatic invertebrates or aquatic insects will feed on the leaf litter, and then fish will feed on the aquatic insects, or bats will feed on the aquatic insects when they emerge from the water. So in that way, they're very stream buffers. Having wooded habitat along streams and wetlands is very important. And you want to make them as wide as you possibly can, incorporate many types of plants and many sizes of plants, so you have a nice diverse habitat. This is a picture of, I believe, Catterskill Creek in the Catskills in New York State, following Hurricanes Irene and, following Hurricane Irene. And as you can see, there's a nice riparian buffer, a forested buffer along much of the stream at the far end of the slide and on to the left of the slide. But along the lower right-hand side where you can see there's been a lot of erosion, it was just a mowed field right up to the edge. And so during the hurricane, where there were trees, it really prevented erosion. It prevented flooding, the flood from damaging the adjacent habitat and land. But where there weren't trees, there was a lot of damage done for quite a distance in. And that's a full-size person there in that slide. And it really, really moved a lot of soil, and probably a lot of sediment went into the stream. And if you were that property owner, that's a lot of land that was really disturbed on your property. So in terms of buffers, the wider you can have a buffer, the better. Just with a little bit of trees along the stream bank, you can have some stabilization. But the wider you can make it, the better it is as wildlife habitat. So 300 feet wide is optimal as a minimum for wildlife habitat. That's not always possible, but if you just think in terms of the wider the better, it's a good concept to keep in mind. You can also create or retain some other important habitat features, retaining large dead and living trees that have cavities, which are basically holes in the trees of varying sizes, can be really important. So many different species use tree cavities either for nesting or to find cover. The black-capped chickadee, for example, nests in holes in trees. The raccoon finds cover in trees. Woodpeckers like to feed on dead trees over there, and they also nest in dead trees. So why bother? Over 35 species of birds and 20 species of mammals require cavities for nesting. Reptiles and amphibians also will use cavities for shelter. So for example, black rat snakes, I found black rat snakes in holes in trees. So they're very important. Some of the species you might find in cavities are flying squirrel, the northern saw-whet owl, pictured at the top right. You might find mink using holes in downed logs or at the base of trees. Raccoons, as I already mentioned. The wood duck uses holes in trees for nesting, the bluebird, a lot of our bat species, and then some other mammals like martins and fishers will use holes in trees. Woodpeckers, the tufted titmouse, black-capped chickadee. There's the barred owl will also use holes in trees to nest. So having dead trees and live trees with holes in them is really important. If you want to create dead trees, you can look at trees on your land that maybe are crowding out other trees, and or if you want to just create some snags, and you can find a few trees that you're willing to sacrifice and create them by girdling. So girdling is basically taking a chainsaw, or I suppose you could probably use an axe, and cutting through the bark into the cambium of the tree, usually two lines right above one another and the whole diameter of the tree. So that's called girdling. And over time, after a couple of years, that tree will die if you girdle it. And it's a way that you can intentionally create these habitat elements in your forest. So recommendations are to try to create or retain 4 to 6 of these snags, they're called dead trees, per acre of forest land. Leaving wood on the forest floor is also very important. So many species use down logs and wood on the forest floor for cover. For example, salamanders will seek shade and moisture under down wood. The ruffed grouse uses logs in the spring to do what's called drumming, which is a sound, like a beating sound that they make with their wings against the log that attracts mates. Small mammals, so chipmunks you'll see running across logs. A lot of birds, turkeys, for example, will nest on the ground on the back side of a log. And so wood on the forest floor can be very important for a lot of different wildlife species. We did some research at Cornell in our teaching and research forest, looking at openings that were used as log landings after a timber harvest. So places where the logger will bring the logs and stack them before they're loaded on the truck and taken to market. And oftentimes the ends of the logs will be cut off and left behind. So we looked at our log landings at the Arnott Forest where we had the logs left behind, and we kind of made, piled them up, versus landings that had no logs left behind and were just the open seeded landing. And we looked at the number of snakes and the coal skinks, which is a lizard that we have here, and how often they were found on these two different types of landings. So some of the species we found were the northern coal skink, pictured at the top, Decay's brown snake, pictured bottom left, and the smooth green snake on the right. These are some typical woodland species. The coal skink is actually, it's rare in most areas, but we have quite a few of them at our teaching and research forest. And when we looked, you can see on the left side of the slide where it says pile, that's where the log landings where we had piles, and there were 4 of them, versus to the right, the log landings without piles, we had 4 of those. And the bars indicate the different species of snakes and the skink that we found and the number of them. So you can see, just generally speaking, that 3 out of the 4 log landings with piles had quite a few very abundant reptiles using them. And on the other hand, the landings without piles, we only had 1 landing that was being used by snakes and skink. So adding piles of wood to openings in the forest, bottom line, whether it's a log landing or just an opening you have, can really enhance habitat for those forest reptiles. We've been doing a lot of research at our forest as well over the years on what's called woody debris. Oftentimes, after following a timber harvest, the tops of the trees are left behind, the marketable logs are removed, and what's left behind is often called debris or slash or other misnomers, we call them, because it's all negative terms. And yes, aesthetically, sometimes it's not that pleasing to look at, but over time, it pretty quickly disappears, it rots, and the nutrients go back into the soil. So we were looking at how much, there was a lot of talk about removing that unnecessary wood from your forest. And, but as I mentioned, that wood left behind serves a lot of purposes in terms of forest health and also wildlife habitat. So we wanted to look at different amounts of wood left behind and what the benefits might be to the forest health and to as wildlife habitat. So in our forest, we have a working research forest, and there was a timber harvest scheduled. So we asked the logger to leave behind various amounts of wood. In one treatment, we asked them to leave everything that was 10 inches in diameter or smaller. And as you can see, that's a lot of wood. We asked that the trees be dropped 2 or 3 kind of crisscrossing one another so that we'd have a pile of the wood in different places in the forest. And so this is a picture of the 10-inch, what we call the 10-inch treatment. And then our second treatment was we asked them to leave in other areas all branches that were 4 inches or smaller in diameter. So you can see that that's a lot less wood, it's smaller wood that's left on the ground, but there's still quite a bit scattered across the forest floor. And then the third treatment, we asked them to remove everything. So remove all the treetops when the harvest was complete. And as you can see, that looks a lot neater. It's maybe aesthetically more pleasing in the beginning, but there's definitely some downsides. So we measured a bunch of different factors in the forest with these piles. We looked at temperature. So there are these little devices called temperature loggers that you see in the bottom, little circular devices that are put outdoors, and they record the temperatures, and you can download them with the computer later. We put one inside the pile of wood, so under the pile of wood, and one out in the open area in the forest where there wasn't a pile. And we monitored the temperatures in many different locations over many years. And what this slide is showing is basically on the bottom line, on the bottom axis is time, so across time, and on the axis on the left is temperature. And the red line is the temperature measuring devices, the temperatures that were measured outside of the piles throughout the summer and into the fall. And what you can see there, when you look at the red lines, is the temperature tends to be a lot hotter and it fluctuates more wildly. So there's a lot of variation in the temperature outside of those piles. When you look at the black line, which is inside the tops of the trees or the piles, the temperature tends to be cooler overall and it doesn't fluctuate as much. It's more stable. And this is really important for a lot of organisms. For example, some tree seedlings, if it gets too hot on the forest floor during the summer, it'll actually cause them to die. Forest salamanders like cool, moist temperatures. They don't do very well in hot and dry climates. And so when you have, a disturbance where the forest canopy comes down and you have a lot of sunlight coming in, the heat and the dryness, especially if you have a drought year, can really affect organisms on the forest floor. And so by leaving piles of wood behind, it can mediate those temperatures and provide at least stepping stones within the forest where you might have some protection from the temperature. As I mentioned, salamanders are very sensitive to environmental change. They need moisture. They don't like really hot temperatures. They have nothing to protect them from drying out. So they dry out very easily. And so if it's too hot and dry in the summer, they actually can't even move about the forest to feed because it's too difficult and too dangerous for them to move about. This is a picture of the redback salamander, which is our most common salamander. It's been found in some research studies to be the most abundant vertebrate that we have, so animal with the backbone in Northeast forests. They're very abundant. And in the same study, we looked at the number of salamanders that were near these piles of wood versus in what we call the whole tree treatment, where there was no wood left behind. And so the two bars, blue bars on the left, show the 10-inch treatment where there was a lot of wood, the 4-inch treatment where there was a medium amount of wood, and then the whole tree where most of the wood, almost all of it on the forest floor, was removed. And you can see that we found a lot more salamanders in the treatments where wood was retained, which is what we might expect. Another benefit of this wood in terms of forest habitat, you can see one of our former interns, Ryan, he's standing next to a pile of the treetops that were 10 inches or smaller. And you can see that almost as long as a deer's, or wide as a long deer's neck is long, the seedlings that were coming up along the edge there are browsed off, so they were eaten. And then they get taller and taller as you go into the center of that pile. So in some cases, if the piles are big enough, they will protect this growing seedlings from being browsed by deer. And just to illustrate that a little bit more, there's a picture from one of our sites on the left where all the treetops were removed from the site 3 years before that. And we really don't have any seedlings growing. You have a lot of goldenrod and some grasses. Versus to the right, there's a picture of the trees growing up through one of our piles of treetops that was left behind. So we're getting good growth of new young trees there. So there can be some protection that's afforded by these piles in terms of deer browsing and allowing tree seedlings to regenerate or regrow. So in summary, wood matters. Wood matters in terms of microclimate, temperature and soil moisture can be mediated in terms of biodiversity. So salamanders can be more abundant and there's more structural complexity, more cover, more habitat or microclimate diversity. And wood might also protect forest seedlings and allow them to grow, allowing us to have greater tree species diversity in the future and to regenerate our forests. So just in summary, to have a variety of different habitats, of forest structures, of forest types across the landscape, not necessarily in one ownership, is really beneficial. And sometimes what looks messy to us is often what's best for wildlife. So for wildlife and biodiversity, messy is often best. And I really like this quote: "Diversity is the key to stability. Quite contrary to human garages, this apparent messiness of nature is actually one of its great assets." So I thank you very much for joining me, and I encourage you all to get outdoors and spend some time in your woods or the woods in your neighborhood. Thank you very much.